Shane Kilkelly.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this episode, we will be talking a little bit about alienation. And we're going to be experimenting with a bit of a different format this time, where we're not going to be talking about any specific work or piece of media, but instead just going over some, I suppose, some basic sort of socialist theory and some of the history behind it.
Yeah, we've talked about it quite a bit in previous episodes, so we just wanted to kind of give an overview of the topic of alienation, so people who haven't read all this stuff have some idea what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's one of these ideas that I think people are intimately familiar with because they've lived it. But not a lot of people don't really have the theoretical grounding or just even the vocabulary to describe these sorts of things. So the basic sort of idea of alienation, as described by Karl Marx, was this kind of estrangement of people from themselves and from their products and from their sort of society at large. And according to Marx, this was all a kind of product of life in a hierarchical class society. And more specifically, how the worker is subordinated and kind of turned into an object in a machine in his own right, and dehumanized by the process of capitalist production. But before we get to Karl, our buddy Karl, we're going to go back and talk a little bit about Adam Smith and the ideas he contributed to this idea. So yeah, Karl, why don't you lead us off on a bit of Smith?
Right. So Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. People think he was an economist often, but actually he was employed as a moral philosopher, and he was kind of dealing with the breakdown of feudal society and trying to make sense of what the new order was that was developing with this new market capitalist society. Of course, he didn't have the term capitalism. Even Marx didn't use the term capitalism, but he did certainly understand that there was a new mercantile order that was coming about. And one of the major ideas that he contributed was an analysis of the division of labor. And he understood sort of what the productivity benefits of the division of labor were, in terms of each person specializing in a particular kind of work, and then that all contributing to a whole that was more productive than one person splitting up many different jobs amongst themselves.
Right, yeah. And he puts the emphasis here on efficiency, that it is simply more efficient to divide up labor in such a way that instead of having, say, a workshop with 6 carpenters turning out chairs, you have a workshop with the same 6 carpenters, except one of them focuses exclusively on producing the legs, one of them produces the seat pans, one of them produces the spindles for the back, one of them assembles it, and then one of them, of course, supervises and directs the whole thing without really touching anything. And this is more efficient.
Right. And, demonstrably more efficient as well, right? The sort of point here was that Adam Smith wasn't really talking about factory work or an assembly line. Those things didn't exist yet. He was talking about, artisans in a small workshop. But what he was able to do was to project that vision of efficiency out into the entire society. And one of the ways he did this was by way of his famous metaphor of an invisible hand, right? That not only would the market coordinate what people wanted to buy and sell and provide some kind of social order in the absence of a monarch ordering the society from the top down, or the church providing canon law, it would also provide a better society in a sense, because that metaphor of the one workshop could be mapped onto the whole society, where everybody was doing a specialized task and producing to a much larger overall product than they could if they had been bound by sort of caste laws about, you know, what kind of work they could do, or were focused exclusively on traditional craft work or peasant labor.
Yeah, so this new system is more efficient and more adaptable. Is the kind of the idea behind the invisible hand, that it's a sort of spontaneous, self-organizing, adaptable system that's able to respond to just changes in demand and desires. Like if for whatever reason there's no more demand for wooden chairs, then those artisans could turn their attention to something else, like making boxes instead.
Yeah, and that's one of the advantages. But Smith did actually recognize some disadvantages to the division of labor as well. He was not simply a booster of capitalism. He did notice a number of problems with it that he outlined, you know, as honestly as he could. And one of these was that the division of labor would, you know, get people doing very monotonous work. That would make them kind of dull in their minds and dull in their characters, because they were forced to do the same thing over and over and over again, and that wouldn't provide them much in the way of personal development.
And like to counteract that, Smith advocates for education as the way of alleviating that problem. That like basically that like turning a handle all day or drilling the same hole in the same piece of wood will just turn the entire workforce into cretins.
And also regulation, state regulation, to kind of limit the extent of the division of labor. Get some of the benefits, but also don't go overboard with it. Right?
It's really interesting kind of looking at this stuff that like this is the kind of frank assessment of both the upsides and downsides of this new system that was emerging that you just don't see anymore. You know, it's even from people who are inclined to quote Adam Smith and lean on him to boost capitalism. Yeah, you just don't really get much of this kind of honesty about downsides of this sort of thing. Like to us now, the downsides tend to simply be ignored instead of ever really being addressed.
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons why Marx had a lot of respect for Smith and Ricardo, was because they did outline these downsides as honestly as they could. So yeah, following up on Adam Smith, we have Hegel, the famous German philosopher, who was similarly trying to think through the transition from a feudal society into a modern capitalist society. But, you know, being German, he did it in terms of abstract philosophy instead of economics, so to speak, right? And he was actually quite deeply influenced by Smith. You might not notice it on the surface of the text because it reads so differently than Smith, but one of the things that he was arguing against was the old caste system that was based on birth, right? So if your father was a carpenter, you were a carpenter. And that was kind of very limiting to personal development. But in a market system with a kind of invisible hand ordering things, you have a very different sort of arrangement where people have more freedom to choose their work, and people are able to share with each other kind of free contributions to the overall well-being of society and its reproduction.
Yeah. And this is the idea of labor really being well developed, and the idea that I produce to meet your needs and you produce to meet my needs, and we all kind of go around in a circle producing for each other, which it's an idea that wasn't particularly well developed before Hegel got to it.
Right.
He was one of the first to kind of articulate this really concrete idea of labor as a human activity that is done in order to meet needs.
as a kind of basis for society, right? In a very sort of positive way, right? Because in Aristotle, he recognizes that labor is the basis of society. However, he assumes that that implies that society should be based on slavery, because there are people who work with their hands, and then there are people who think. And you need to have the people who work with their hands to support the people who do the thinking, such as Aristotle. So
that idea is still with us, but it's hidden behind quite a few layers now.
Yeah,
because I was just thinking, like, wow, that just sounds so quaint and stupid, and then I thought, no, that's actually still how people think, right? Like,
yeah,
there is very much an underclass that produces so that the elite CSS programmers can get on with their work, you know?
Yeah, so, what Hegel kind of did was to take this idea of labor as a positive thing that the individual can do and bring that into the core of philosophy, both as a kind of individual thing and also as like a social a basis for society as a whole. And the way that he reasoned that this whole thing could work together, because, he read Smith, so he understood that there were downsides to this kind of system, was to have the civil service regulate and order this division of labor, right? So that it would actually work rationally for everybody in the society. Everybody would contribute, everybody would get something back. And because of that, Hegel thought that the civil service was a universal class, because they don't actually produce anything themselves, but they take in the substance of everything that is produced by everyone else in society, and they return the universal order that the society needs. So, it's kind of strange to think about this combination of market liberalism with bureaucracy. I guess you kind of see it in the ethos of the Democratic Party, but for Hegel, this was kind of a natural combination because at that time, it was in the wake of the French Revolution, and Napoleon's armies had come through Germany, and they had introduced some kinds of legal changes, the Napoleonic Code changes, in some parts of Germany that had gotten rid of the old medieval legal order and had therefore introduced this kind of sort of universal idea of law. And in the wake of Napoleon's armies, you had these bureaucrats who were supposed to organize things. And when the reaction came that got rid of that new order and tried to roll back the clock to the old medieval times, it meant that the young people who had wanted to become bureaucrats or who had been bureaucrats, the young students who had been studying to do this, were out of work.
Right.
And so you had these young people who had studied, they'd read lots of new ideas, they were very, intellectually bright, and they were very ambitious, and they've been denied their chance at a job. So you had this combination of liberalism and bureaucratic advancement at that time that came together, and actually was a very powerful social force in a way that might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but it did open up a kind of new ideal for society.
But it sort of calls back to I think what we were talking about in the last episode with Graeber and his article, that the market and bureaucracy aren't exactly counter to each other either. That like there is a sort of a very natural mixture of those two in, I suppose, a kind of managerial, disciplinarian kind of an ideology. Right. And so you kind of see a very positive vision of that in Hegel, and to a lesser extent in Adam Smith. Right? Yeah. it's interesting to see the roots of that,
Yeah, and actually, I was mentioning that the Democratic Party kind of embodies some of this sort of ideology, but a lot of American liberalism has its roots in Hegel. So it's not entirely surprising that there's a connection there. But anyway, so Hegel has this kind of beautiful idea about what liberal society could look like, a market capitalist society could look like. But there's a problem that he hadn't really accounted for, and that is the problem of unemployment. So, in his ideal vision, you have everybody contributing to the society, and then the civil service is basically making a contribution by ensuring that everything is running smoothly. However, if you have people who are out of work and are out of work on a long-term basis, which is a problem that was completely novel in human society, unemployment was not a thing that existed before capitalism. You have the kind of opposite of the universal class, right? These people who contribute nothing to the moral substance of the society.
The rabble.
They produce nothing, but they also contribute nothing. Whereas the civil service kind of takes in a little bit of everything and produces a little bit of everything. So it's like the opposite of the universal class, right?
It's interesting to see this kind of like glaring gap in this conception of the world. And then to realize that like, it's still not been addressed, right? Like this problem is still not really being thought about or being worked on in any significant way. Most people by now just sort of accept, there's just the way things are. There's always unemployment.
Right. The so-called natural rate of unemployment is accepted to be both high and real.
Right, but that's also like transhistorically sort of applied as well. Like you get this kind of idea that ever since primordial times, there's always been a sort of lumpen underclass of people who laid about and did nothing, and then it's such a weird sort of conception.
And I mean that is a thing that existed in many periods of time, but the thing was that it was a novelty to have people who had some kind of skill and were used to doing some kind of work, but then being put out of that work and having nothing to do. That was the novelty, right? Because the thing was, you come up with this division of labor, it increases the productivity of society, but it also opens up the possibility of people being unemployed. And this meant that these people were alienated from society, right? And I think this is a really important point, that some people talk about unemployment as though it's mainly about absolute poverty, right? That, you don't have a roof over your head, you don't have something to eat. Well, that's often the case. But I think, as somebody who has been unemployed in the past for a long time, about a year, the thing that really gets to you is feeling as though you are an outcast from society, and that you aren't doing your part, that you're not contributing, that you don't have worth as a person because you aren't contributing to society.
And even that your daily cycle doesn't match with anyone else's, and you're kind of like, if you make friends with someone, they eventually sort of wonder why you're always available to go to lunch in the middle of a town, or or if you're kind of like, you never seem to be held down by a commitment to the clock in the way they are, and it kind of eventually comes out and all that kind of thing. Because I went through the same thing, unemployed for quite a while, on and off. I've done that precarious work sort of thing, and it's like having a wage coming in and having money is not just about having this liquid asset with which you can buy things on the market. Like money is the employment and the money is a power thing as well, and it outlines your position in the hierarchy. And like it's very clear that when you're unemployed in this position again of like having useful skills and yet somehow being outside of the system, it's made very clear that you are outside of it.
Yeah, so when Hegel talks about this stuff, it feels kind of airy-fairy, as it can often be with his writing, but it really does speak to an actual problem, right? That you do feel like you're outside the moral community, that you're not contributing to the moral substance of the community, and people view you in that way, right? And so this was a real problem that he became aware of and didn't really have a solution to. So that kind of brings us to Marx, right?
Our boy Karl, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And he wasn't a direct student of Hegel, but he was a student of Hegel's student. And he was a Hegelian to begin with.
He was, yeah. And he came in here and really laid down the law with this stuff. In general, when he approaches this stuff, he kind of outlines that the political economists and the kind of philosophers that kind of came before had like started from what he saw as like false axioms and false premises. Like they had accepted private property and the division of labor as axiomatic and then gone from there. Whereas Marx wanted to really dig in beneath that and get to the relations and dynamics that underlaid all of that stuff. And he kind of finds at the heart of it that there's these deeply entangled sort of ideas of private property and exchange relations, of alienation and money, are all kind of like mutually entangled, so that they kind of produce each other. There isn't a clean flow of causality between these ideas.
Right. And I mean, so for Marx, the sort of textbook example of stupid bourgeois thinking was Robinson Crusoe, right? That is a book that takes capitalist ideas about production and exchange and market society and valuation and all this kind of stuff as natural, and like it's like, oh, what if this bourgeois person was transported to an alien environment and they had to reconstruct civilization around them, right? That's kind of the premise of Robinson Crusoe. And this was an enormously popular book, right? It was like, you know, everybody kind of had a copy of the Bible and a copy of Robinson Crusoe. It was kind of the situation apparently at that time.
Right.
So Marx, you know, took aim at this idea, and one of the things he did was to talk about sort of historical genesis of capitalism, like capitalism as a thing that did not exist and then it did exist. And for many bourgeois thinkers, you know, they had some notion that this was the case, that there was a time before a market society arose. Of course, like, you know, they could read their history, they could see, you know, the Middle Ages and stuff like that. But for them, it was that you had a society that was unnatural, and then you reached the true natural society. But for Marx, it was more a question of, well, how did we get here and where are we going, right? And, you know, one of the things he did was to go and first establish an understanding of how you get from simple commodity production for like one person making stuff for themselves. How do you get from there to a market society in which people are doing monetary exchanges, right? And this was a thing that he took from Ricardo to start with, but he developed it further. And there's a few ways in which alienation kind of factored into that discussion, right? The first was that when you are making something for sale, even in your head before you make the thing, it's alienated from you because you have no concept of using it yourself.
Yeah,
right?
It's like, if you're churning out hundreds of teapots per day, there's absolutely no way that you're thinking, I really want to use this teapot, right? It's already been detached from you, and it's already a piece of your life has gone into, like, even just in the sense of like a span of time has gone into manufacturing this object, but it is immediately pushed away from you, and it sails away into the rest of the world.
Yeah, and if you can't sell it, then you're going to trash it because you can't use it yourself. I have no use to fill up my entire house with teapots, right?
Yeah. That would be insane.
Yeah. So that
almost as if producing hundreds of teapots is kind of insane.
Right, but I mean that's the point, right? Is that in a society of simple commodity production, you would never think to even do that because
Why would you? Yeah.
Why would you fill up your house with teapots? I mean, yeah.
But it's also like that. So the worker is alienated from his product, but also from the process itself. That like, so if producing the thing it is alienated, then the very act of producing it must be kind of producing alienation. And so the worker is like, and this is something like everyone listening to this will already be intimately familiar with this idea of like being alienated from the process of doing your work. It's a process that's under this kind of regime of producing commodities for sale on the market. Like the process of doing that takes up a huge amount of your day, and yet it's outside of your life. It's external to your life as a human. It's a grueling task that you put yourself through in order to be essentially permitted to live. It's kind of how it pans out, you know?
Right, and that was kind of what Smith was getting at with his sort of questioning of the value of the division of labor. But Marx kind of takes this further because he thinks about exchange between individuals, and of course there is that alienation that's implied in making something that you don't really want yourself. You're only producing it for the market, which becomes this kind of generic person that you exchange things with, right? And at a certain level of exchange, you go from a barter exchange to going to a monetary exchange. And this is where money takes on the form of that anonymous person that is the market that you are exchanging with, right? It becomes this universal equivalent that stands in for everything else that is produced in the economy. And that has a lot of social consequences in terms of what it means when you go through the cash nexus, when you go through money to relate to everyone else in the society. So if I am making a direct exchange with you as a person, if I'm producing teapots and you're producing hammers or something, and we go and exchange these things, we have a fairly clear understanding of what the labor was that went into that exchange, right? We understand that we both worked to produce these respective things, and that we can see that in each other.
And if I see that like your hands are burned with like what seems to be burns from a kiln, I kind of understand that producing this commodity has harmed you in some way.
Yeah.
Or if I notice that all the trees, as far as anyone can see around your home, have all been chopped down and you're selling things made of wood, I know that the environment around you has been destroyed in order to produce the little wooden 19th century fidget spinners that you're going to sell me. You know?
Yeah.
But like using money and kind of like intermediating those things hides a lot of details. Like all of the qualities of the object are boiled down to one number, a single number that determines what it's worth. And the human cost of production, the environmental cost, or any other cost you could care to name, are all obscured behind this number. And it's not helped by the remoteness as well, that like you're going to the market and buying something that could have come from anywhere. You know, it's you never quite know what's gone into it. And so the relations between people are obscured by this.
Right, and this is all made possible by the universality of money, right? The fact that we can have a world market is made possible because money can buy anything in particular, right? And it does stand in against every single commodity you could possibly imagine.
And so kind of like ultimately you kind of have this thing where as a worker, you're alienated from the product you're making. You're alienated from the process of doing that, and you're kind of also alienated from the society at large or from the rest of the species, and turned into this atomized, essentially an object in your own right. You know, you're kind of this is the objectification of labor in that sense.
Yes, it's not a it's a kind of general objectification, right? That your labor becomes abstract in a way. And you're only worthwhile insofar as you can provide a certain quantity of that.
Yeah, and Marx kind of articulates it as that, like, the worker, having kind of put all of his life force into producing these things, is then confronted by that product as an alien force, and he finds himself in a kind of like, as the worker is drained of energy, the world of objects becomes strong, and he's then the worker then must kind of like confront this world of objects, which has grown more powerful than the world of people has. Yeah,
and you know, the quote that's often mentioned from the first chapter of Capital is there it is, a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the fantastic form of a relation between things. So we don't relate to each other as producers and consumers, respectively. We only relate to each other as the teapot meeting the hammer in the market, and those being reduced to a monetary ratio, right?
Yeah, and I think this accounts for a lot of people's dissatisfaction and sort of like alienation from just contemporary life in general. Like, it is pretty hard to kind of walk around in a world of like kind of like people who behave like objects and objects that behave like people. You know,
yeah,
where everything is blurred together and is kind of really kind of horrible mess when you kind of consider it. Or even like I think when Marx says that like the world of things becomes stronger, I think like it's in some cases actually literal, in that we create machines and objects and processes which then end up absolutely dominating our lives, like finance as a system that has been manufactured by human hands and yet has a life of its own. That the life force that's drained out of people to create these things actually kind of literally gives the objects life of their own. It's like a Toy Story sort of thing almost.
Yeah, and I mean, people often say that the real protagonist of Capital as a narrative is capital, right? That there is this inhuman thing that becomes progressively more and more powerful in that
I sometimes wonder if like that's some of the appeal of like Lovecraftian horror in a way, that like, because I think on a subconscious level we're all acquainted with this idea of like a horrifying spectral presence that is everywhere at once and controls everything indirectly, and that you have no way of confronting head on. Like, you know, finance as a sort of otherworldly monster that sort of directs the course of human history in this very alien way, that like, and like you see it even in our politics and our general sort of socio-political kind of life, that like there's this constant deference to these things and objects that have been created. Like, it's like, oh, well, you know, we could, you know, we would love to solve this problem, but like the objects would be harmed by doing that. You know,
right? The market, it would be like that. It's like that episode of excuse me, of South Park that was about the financial crisis, where they were sort of making fun of the idea of the market as a person or as some kind of personified divinity that people could upset, right? The way we reason about the market as though it is one thing, and as though it has sort of emotions or a mood that could be upset by our bad actions, right? We kind of deify the market, and in a sense that is that's exactly what Marx meant by the fetishism of commodities. He didn't mean fetishism as in like kinky shit. He meant fetishism as in a fetish, as in a religious symbol.
Fetish in the sense of being a little wooden statue of some divine thing that you carry around, which isn't a term that's used very much anymore. But
but he took it from anthropology of his time, right? So as we've kind of been saying, in a sense, for Marx, you can see the invisible hand that Smith came up with as a bad thing, right? Because we have this fantastic relation between things that we start to think about the world in terms of, the invisible hand is this kind of strange, fantastical creature that we imagine in our heads, right? It is the market, quote unquote, in capital letters, right? So yes, it provides a kind of order to things, but there's many problems that come along with that, right? In terms of alienation, as well as, in terms of financial crisis and that kind of thing. But when you really boil it down, you get to the point that in capitalism, labor is indirectly social, because every laborer is related to the other through the division of labor by the market. So as we've been saying, there's that veil of money that is obscuring the relationship between each producer.
Yeah. And it's sort of like, it points in the direction of what a solution to all this might be. To kind of like, we're a socialist podcast. We're going to try to like wrap up each episode on a sort of positive note, gesturing in the direction of where a future socialism might go. And I think if we're going to take on this problem of alienation and we're going to counter it with disalienation, we're kind of going to need to get rid of a lot of these mediating layers and these indirections in how we produce and how we meet needs. We'll need to become much more directly social.
Yeah, and this is the sort of promise of socialism, that we can assume a direct relationship to each other as producers and consumers, and that we can think honestly about how we relate to each other because that is the case. If we don't think about our relation to each other in terms of producing for the market, but instead of producing for each other as human beings, then we can start to think about these issues in qualitative terms instead of simply quantitative terms, right?
Right. So that, like, when we're assessing any given object or service or a good that might meet a need, we'll take into account not just its cost, but what the human impact of its production was, what the environmental impact, any sort of impact you could name, any factor that could go into it, which is currently being obscured. It's like everyone's sort of familiar with this, right? Where like we consume phones and laptops and shit that are like, they contain rare earth minerals that are acquired under kind of sketchy circumstances, and to see this stuff kind of shines through a little bit in how people on the internet have a sort of fascination with these viral images in which you've got like a photo of like a shirt or something, but the lapel or the label has "Please help me, they keep me in a dark room all day and beat me" sewn into it. Where like the person who is sewing the shirt has broken through the veil and reached out to tell you about the conditions under which they live, which are usually obscured, but under very certain circumstances can be broken, and that's kind of a taster of all the sort of stuff we'll need to take into account going forward, because like even if you're not swayed for some reason by those sorts of like human suffering, we've still got this environmental crisis bearing down on us, and the theme there is that like we cannot afford to keep these externalities external, right? Because like that's been the mode of operation so far, is to like externalize all these costs, externalize the environmental cost, externalize the human cost, and simply not take it into account at all when pricing things. That's got to come to an end. We've got to bring all this stuff back in if we're going to survive at all.
Right. Right. And, what socialism offers in a sense is beyond simply internalizing external costs. It is being because the whole thing about internalizing external costs into the market, into market price, is that it still perpetuates the fetishism of commodities in a sense, right? Because the consumer still has really no understanding of how those costs were internalized. And yeah, it has that kind of mediation to it that still has some negative consequences. But if we want to think about the kinds of ways that we value things in a democratic and sort of deliberative way, then we can actually debate what our society invests in and how we go about things in a qualitative sense, where we actually think about, well, what does this look like? How does it feel? What does it mean to us? Instead of simply saying, oh, well, we need to have carbon credits or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the other sort of angle on disalienation, in that, if we do that, we can kind of deliberately and collectively agree on what our values are and disalienate ourselves from each other and from the kind of social organization, whether that's a state or whatever you want to call it, workers' councils, etc. But that, we can actually be empowered as people to deliberately choose what our kind of pattern of life is.
Right. And so there is this kind of objection that comes up, to this line of argument that, and it's particularly powerful, I think, since the 90s. This line of thinking about sophisticated consumers, where consumers function as aesthetic judges in society. And this was an idea that actually Hayek was a big fan of, that, there's this thought in a market society that reduces everything to quantity, you could have a degeneration into just producing the cheapest crap you possibly could, and everybody's just shoveling empty calories into their mouths, and it's this kind of Wall-E-esque hellscape, right? Or just these consumer dystopias, right? That everything's reduced to the lowest common denominator, and there's no appreciation of beauty because everyone's just trying to maximize utility per unit, right, for the lowest possible cost. And so a counterpoint to that, which is brought up by some defenders of capitalism, is that no, we have sophisticated consumers now, and these people, we judge commodities in aesthetic terms. We're discerning, and so we impose aesthetic norms, qualitative norms on the commodities we purchase. And this is kind of like, well, no, I don't just simply buy I won't buy a McDonald's hamburger. I must go to the farm to table hamburger store in order to have my hamburger. And so it's beautiful, and it's in a beautiful space, and the sort of conditions of production are taken into account. But there's obviously issues with this, right?
Yeah, it's still a commodity relation, right? There's still that obscuring factor. You can't exactly trust that the farm to table option is actually farm to table,
Yeah, and it's often the case that things that are very beautiful, such as say a new iPhone, are produced under conditions that are decidedly not beautiful, such as Foxconn workers killing themselves from overwork, right?
Yeah, so this is a fairly empty idea, really. The sophisticated consumers and the
because it still cannot account for the problems of the production process, or the problems of sourcing, or the problems of environmental impact. All it can do is create a kind of social order where the richest people are able to establish certain beauty norms for the rest of society.
Right, but even at that, like, it's like having the slightly better option doesn't get rid of the lower one, right? Like, it's like the sophisticated consumers are only ever going to be a vanishing minority of the actual population, right? Like, and there isn't really much comfort to be taken in that kind of thing of like, oh, I'm going to get grass-fed beef for X dollars per pound, and literally everyone else is still going to have to subsist on the lower quality stuff. Like, it's such a non-solution that it's kind of hard to imagine. It is a
non-solution. It's very irrational, and it only feels good to people who are on the sort of judging and establishing side of things, i.e. the rich, right?
The bougie end of the spectrum, yeah.
Because, there is a sort of self-satisfaction in defining the quality of your consumption as opposed to the hoi polloi, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, my craft beer, blah, 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 or, whatever. And people love to talk about this stuff endlessly. And, actually, like, class distinction can have enormous aesthetic impacts. One example I like to point out is brutalist architecture. When brutalist architecture was the primary mode of architectural design for designing social housing or council flats or whatever, it was derided as this kind of like monstrous outgrowth of the machine age and the degeneration of the individual mind and beauty and everything. But then once those council flats all got privatized by Thatcher, and they could be sold and reworked into upscale individual apartments, renovate the interiors and everything, then brutalism became very chic.
Yeah.
Right. And suddenly it was we all forgot about the beauty of brutalism, and we misunderstood its true inner greatness and all this kind of thing. And that is a major change in aesthetic evaluation just because the consumers changed. You went from the poor owning the thing to the rich owning the thing. It's the same thing, but the valuation of it changes completely, right?
Yeah, and like we're supposed to take these pricks seriously, like such transparently dumb ideas of like the mindless class signaling, complete U-turns on these sorts of ideas, and we're still supposed to trust that they fucking know what they're doing. I don't know.
Yeah. And one of the important things there is to just not forget, right? Mm-hmm. Let's not forget what people used to think about these things. And let's not forget why the evaluation changed, because that's often also the case that people say, oh, well, we just misunderstood. It's like, no, you didn't misunderstand. It's like in the first case, you were judging from your class position, and the second case, you were also judging from your class position.
But now they have money involved and an investment in these things. So it's a fucking hollow argument. You heard it here, folks. Aesthetics are bullshit.
Well, it's not that aesthetics are bullshit. It's that aesthetics that are constructed on the basis of a very limited and prejudiced position, namely like your wealth, are bullshit because they're not universal, right?
Yeah, that's
the problem.
That's a theme that'll be coming up in a lot of these rebuttals of these kind of propositions, that like a lot of these just aren't universal and therefore kind of don't work or can't work. They can only ever work to kind of like satisfy the or to kind of soothe and pacify the sort of middle class and above. Like the fair trade thing is another one that's often brought, like, oh, well, can't you just get in some sort of artisanal kale crop to address this. And like, no, not really. Or can't you do like you buy fair trade beans instead? It's like, well, it doesn't scale. And that's the problem, right? And but the fair trade thing is also used as a sort of class differentiator thing. It's like they're not using the fair trade crops as a replacement for the shitty exploitative ones. I mean, as shitty and as exploitative as the fair trade stuff is anyway, they're using it as a niche product to sell to bougie assholes.
That's right. So it's like on one level, it takes the critique of commodity fetishism into account, as in like, oh, but like, aren't we forgetting about the conditions of production? But on the other hand, it doesn't take it into account, right? Because it doesn't go far enough, right?
But this is a thing in late capitalism, though, where it's able to subsume all of its sort of like the objections against it and all of the kind of movements against it and just kind of regurgitate them as a part of itself, like an ever-replicating fungus. You know?
Yeah. It internalizes the critique and turns it into a commodity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you have an objectification of like the subject position of the person who understands that, you know, there is a thing such as commodity fetishism, right?
Yes, meta objectification, and then that'll get swallowed again, right? Like, and it'll be wrapped in another layer, like a disgusting pearl, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
More and more layers of objectified accretions of subject positions turned into objects, and then objects turned into subject positions.
Yeah, they were just talking about something like this on the show Thinking Aloud on BBC the other I think it was like last week. They were talking about how people represent themselves in job hunting, and one of the things that has become very prevalent in job hunting over the last, say, 15, 20 years is the idea of branding and the personal brand, right? And the person that they had on the show made a really astute point, which was that branding was originally a practice developed by the advertising industry in order to give a personality to an object, right? So branders would ask questions like, well, if Coca-Cola was a person, what kind of person do you think they would be, right? And sort of trying to develop the veneer of personality for each of these products. But the thing is that this practice, which was used to impute personality to objects, is now being used to impute personality to people. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. So we think about ourselves as objects, and then we try to either sort of introspect or to look out into the world at what's popular in order to develop a brand of ourselves, right?
Yeah.
And that's just kind of this commodity alienation taken to the nth degree, right?
Yeah, it really is. And it's pretty grim. And sort of like, I think the personal branding stuff is a good way to segue into one of the other examples that's often kind of raised of like the kind of the Patreon kind of model of providing a non-alienated relationship between producers and consumers.
Yeah, and I mean, Patreon, you know, obviously this will be old news by the time this airs, but they've just gone through this huge debacle about changing their funding model. And I think the attraction for Patreon in the sort of fundamental way is that they offer a kind of model for mutual aid, right? In the sort of libertarian socialist sense, right? That individuals can support each other in a kind of very direct sense through Patreon. And there is a kind of utopian promise to Patreon that the corporation exploits in their branding operations, right? And a lot of the anger that has come out as a result of this change in funding model is because people feel that that utopian promise has been betrayed, right? And mainly, like, the site of that is people who are contributing like $1 as like a kind of tip jar thing, or people who are receiving donations in the form of like that level of contribution. And there's not much money in that because there's transaction costs involved. And if Patreon eats the transaction costs, then yeah, maybe they can make a little bit of money off of that, but they're not as profitable as they could be. I mean, that idea that they need to be more profitable in order to be attractive to investors goes directly into conflict with the premise of Patreon as a kind of platform for mutual aid.
Yeah, definitely. And like, I kind of think that like the promise of Patreon could be better realized either as a utility or something that was run as a sort of workers' co-op or something like that, because there isn't actually much. And here we see some of the kind of weaknesses of capitalism, that like, because it's driven by this profit motive, and it kind of can't serve these needs where there isn't much. There's a definite need for the thing to exist, but there isn't much scope for a profit to be drawn out of it. They end up warping and distorting the product to fit the needs of venture capitalists more so than to fit the needs of the creators and subscribers or whatever that that kind of gave it legs in the first place. And I think almost like but Patreon should really be just a feature of the banking system. You know, like it should be, if banking was more high tech, this would be just a feature of a bank account. Like you could publish an address, an obfuscated address, like a kind of like a Bitcoin address. You know what I mean? And that people would just be able to click on it and like hook their bank up to it and do that kind of thing. Like Patreon sort of inserts itself as a mediating layer in between this thing, but they've then found that there isn't actually that much money to be made by doing that. And so
yeah, because they provide an administrative service, but it's
purely administrative.
It's not an enormously profitable one.
But in general, though, like it can't be applied to the entire division of labor, and like so it's not really a model for anything beyond the sort of creative industries that it's currently used for.
Well, and even within those industries, we see that it produces enormously unequal outcomes, right? That there's a tiny, tiny minority of Patreon users who are actually able to earn a decent living off of their revenue.
Yeah, it's a classic power distribution where, you have like an absolute handful, like definitely sub 1% of the creators on there are earning what you would call a living wage, or at least above a sort of a decent sort of wage. And then there's that gigantic tail of people who just aren't making a living off of it. Like it's weird to hold this up as a model for people being able to make a living off of their work when in actual fact almost no one is. Because that enormous tail of like LGBT youths like making furry fan art and stuff like that, and getting a handful of dollars a month. It's not a living, you know. It's not a model for how you would have a unalienated relation between producer and consumer, really.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because, you know, a lot of the people who are contributing to those people's work, which is, you know, obviously of varying quality, but, you know, some of it's very high quality. And they're often people who are in just as bad a financial situation as the people they're contributing to, right? So
I did see that as a little joke on Twitter. It was like kind of like it's like basically getting on along the lines that there is a circular relationship there, that like the sort of marginalized artists all supporting each other in a big circle, like the classic story of a penny going around a village, you know?
Exactly. It's one of the main problems with mutual aid as a strategy, right? That, like, yes, it's good, but if all the capital is held by a tiny minority who have nothing to do with your mutual aid scheme, it is just kind of spreading the meager wealth around within an impoverished community. So anyway, I mean, I think that kind of gets at that issue, and you know, it's a thing that I've always kind of had ambivalent feelings about, because I remember when Kickstarter first started up, I was very excited about it in a way, because it was something that I had thought about a lot in the past as like, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this under socialism? Like, you know, what if we could fund artistic production in a kind of voluntary way instead of having it all being done through state funding organizations? Wouldn't that be nice? And then Kickstarter happened, and it was a huge thing. And obviously I knew from the beginning that it would be like, well, there's obviously going to be caveats on how effective this is going to be, because it is a capitalist organization. And it has created some good stuff, but I feel like it has also, people have soured on it a lot because of sort of the fundamental alienation that is implied in the market relations it has.
Yeah.
And Patreon sort of feels like that again, right?
Yeah, and it's like the key point there is that it is all still just market relations, right? Like, it's still that core problem of like producing something and then taking it to, like, putting it in an abstract form and then taking it to the market to be traded in this kind of way that strips the object and yourself of humanity, as that's the thing we kind of need to get rid of, right? Like, having more sophisticated markets isn't going to alleviate those actual problems.
Yeah. So I think we've talked about, fair trade, Patreon. Another point that comes up often is open source as a kind of model for sort of alternative, non-alienated work, right? People, again, sort of on the basis of mutual aid, people working together voluntarily to produce something. Never mind that the vast majority of open source work is done on company payroll.
Either that or it's not compensated at all.
Yeah, it's one of the two, right? That you're doing it on company time, and there's a kind of producer cooperative among large tech companies to provide code to each other. Which is, secondarily shared with everybody else, but they're not the primary consumers. And then there are the coders who are doing open source work as portfolio building, going into the industry, and so they're kind of being exploited in providing that code to the open source repositories. They're just doing it in order to get visibility. To pad out their resumes, and there's a problem there, because oftentimes these projects will be left by the wayside when they do get paying work. And then finally, you have the projects that are neither portfolio building nor corporate sponsored, but instead are projects that are ongoing personal work, right? Passion projects. And yeah, oftentimes the people who are producing these things are living in desperate poverty.
Yeah, like a good examples would be like OpenSSL, I think Vim, a couple of other things like that. And like I think it's OpenSSL I'm thinking of, where like it took a huge crisis, like I think it was the Heartbleed vulnerability, to finally bring people's attention to the fact that it was one guy who I don't think was working otherwise, but like definitely wasn't in a position to be constantly kind of doing this thing, and only then did any kind of funding start to flow into the project at all. Which I think that a lot of like I do open source stuff. I'm kind of like generally very positive about it, but like I think there's a real utopian kind of like, or just a very naive kind of conception of what it is from a lot of open source adherents, where it's like
there's not a lot of understanding of the political economy of open source.
And I think we're going to have to do an episode on that, maybe get some guests in to talk about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because, in at some level, it is inspiring.
I think it is a model for the future in a way, but like we would have to get to a point before being able to really kind of look into judgments on it. We'd have to get to a point where like anyone is being compensated for their labor in open source at all. Like people outside of Red Hat making money off of it would be a prerequisite for even beginning to pass judgment on whether it's a viable model, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the response to Heartbleed is very telling, right? That there was this kind of ad hoc, like, pseudo-socialist effort thrown together by these large tech companies is like, oh my god, we need to do something to prop up these people that we've been exploiting for however many years, in order to make sure that there's some security to our systems, right? But like, obviously that is a very problematic response compared to what could be provided in a society where everyone was able to live without want. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Because like in that kind of a society, OpenSSL guy would be able to just crack on with that work and not have to worry about how to keep the electricity flowing into the house.
Yeah, because no one's going to accuse him of doing it for the money, you know? Obviously, it's a labor of love. Wouldn't have to worry about grifters in that situation, yeah.
That's a good way to conceptualize of a socialist society, though, like that. It would enable much more in the way of labors of love and kind of like exploratory work to be done.
And that's kind of an ideal in terms of non-alienated labor, right?
That's what you get when you have like access to the means of production. Like when the means of production aren't being actively held away from you, you can kind of say, because I don't know, like I think an example might be if I wanted to do some research into like machine learning or AI stuff, I had like a crazy harebrained idea that might work out. I would have to find a way of getting a shit ton of GPUs, which might involve in the best case, or the most feasible case would involve hefty AWS bills. And it's like, frankly, kind of beyond my means, you know, whereas like imagine a socialist kind of future in which a programmer with a similar kind of thing of like, hey, I have this idea that it's just crazy enough that it might work, you know, I need to have a go at it, but it does need substantial compute resources, would be able to just kind of apply for the compute time and have it doled out.
Without having the entanglements that are implied in going and getting venture capital funding.
Yeah, right? Exactly, right. So that's a huge barrier. I mean, sort of technology is an interesting kind of field in that, like, in some ways, anyone with a laptop and a copy of Ubuntu can kind of get something off the ground, but then that's not true. That's another thing that doesn't scale, right? Like, not everything's a web app, you know? It's that's not really a model for everything.
A Pomodoro counter.
Yeah. So the model for that kind of future would be that, like, with this kind of invisible hand removed from humanity's throat, we would kind of be able to abandon these kind of the bad faith practices of capitalist life and all this disavowal of the actual effects of production, disavowal of our actual relations to people, and actually kind of face each other.
That does get back to our discussion in Blade Runner, right?
Yeah, right. The disavowal, that was a huge theme in that movie. But without that, like, people will be able to kind of face each other as equals, without the mediating layers, and actually be able to deal with each other honestly.
Yeah, exactly. So that can be very challenging. That can be quite unpleasant in some ways, because there are conflicting interests between people and conflicting points of view and conflicting values. But it's kind of a question of whether your solution to that problem is to establish a social hierarchy that gives some people the ability to impose their values on others, or whether it is a matter of trying to work through those disagreements in the best possible faith, right? In the most equal possible position, like what Habermas called like the ideal speech situation, right? Is you can, that if there were no extraneous issues, and there are problems with Habermas's formulation because you don't solve every kind of problem with talk, right? You know, there's other sorts of avenues to getting people to understand your point of view that aren't about talk, and that is kind of a very bourgeois understanding of how disputes should be resolved.
Yeah. You see that a lot in the emphasis on, I suppose, what you would call kind of like respectability politics of the kind of liberal crowd, like the Democrats, where everything is, we just need to reach an olive branch across the aisle and sit down and just hash things out, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Like that very like gentleman's club and smoking jackets view of how problems need to be resolved is really a small portion of the way that people actually relate to each other. So I don't want to overemphasize that point, but it is a matter of saying, like, you know, how can we work through these questions as equals, instead of saying, you know, for example, that I get to decide what is beautiful because I'm rich, and I get to patronize artists, or I get to buy fancy things. But it's also a matter of, how do we structure labor in the society? Do women do emotional labor just because they're women and it's expected of them? Or do we actually have to think about how we divide up the labor amongst each other in an honest way, instead of just sort of saying, well, you know, women like to do care work, and so we'll just let the women do that. And, you know, there's these norms that are established that simplify the question for the people who are on the winning side of that equation.
Yeah, definitely. Right. It's a good example. It's a very good example of a bad faith characteristic of our contemporary society. Yeah, I think it does serve as a very good example of the kind of the tenor of the problems ahead while we deconstruct this. This sort of thing.
And you know, this whole Me Too debate and phenomenon that's come about this year, where this sort of extent of patriarchal violence that exists in the society has been revealed in a way that it hasn't been before. That has been very unsettling. Even to myself, it's very, very unsettling. Deeply made me sort of question what it means to be a man. And that is the kind of thing that you would expect to happen in many areas of life in a society where people had a more equal basis to deal with each other.
Yeah. And the sort of the more equal basis of dealing with each other as well is going to bring us on to another point in the notes, that like with the socialist world we're kind of envisioning, that we really want everyone to have equal access to justice, which is like categorically not the case currently.
Yeah, it's so obvious that even people who are very right-wing in their views will admit the point that how rich you are determines the quality of legal representation you will get, and therefore your access to justice.
Yeah, and right? it's this big it's kind of one of the big lies of the kind of the bourgeois state, right? That like everyone's equal under the law, yada yada yada, and it's just not the case. Like, and I think everyone knows this, that like justice is bought and sold. It's your ability to survive or even come out victorious in any kind of legal battle is largely determined by your ability to pay for counsel. And even in places which have access to free legal counsel, a lot of those they're fucking terrible. The representatives are doing yeoman's work there, like trying their best, but it's not good representation in most cases.
They're often overworked, right?
They're overworked, or it's being defunded and taken away, you know. Even that isn't a defense against the kind of fundamental inequality, that like the fundamental fact that like a dollar isn't just a thing to buy a commodity with, it's also power, right? And people who have more dollars have more power, and people who have less dollars have less power. And that is just a fundamental problem in this system that ensures that a vast mass of people don't have real meaningful access to the state or to the justice system.
Yeah, that's right. So, you know, we are alienated from the social decision making in our society, and by extension, we're also alienated from access to justice. And that is like the thing that Hegel was wrestling with when we go back to that discussion, right? That this isn't really a rational society because there is a, you know, for him, I don't know how much this was evident to him, but for us, we can see that for the vast majority of people, we are alienated from justice and from being able to have a say in the direction of a society. And that's been completely obvious in this tax reform issue that's come up in the U.S. And, you know, like, I'm not American, I don't live in the United States, but obviously, as the richest country in the world, the decisions that are made there are going to affect everybody.
Yeah, and
the entire
I think
world, right?
As well as like, I mean, it affects everyone in the world because like it's the sort of leader of this kind of Western sort of market, globalized market economy. But it's also that like, I think this is an interesting thing that I think a lot of non-Americans, including myself and yourself, are like very deeply invested in how things turn out in America. At least partially because like I think it'll set the tone for the next century, right? Like I think socialism is probably most possible to kick off in America because it's not possible for the CIA to go and bomb America. You know, it's like if this project is going to take root anywhere properly, it's probably going to be there. You know, or even just like if this stuff keeps getting worse, right? Like the rightward swing keeps going, then like that's going to set the tone for politics everywhere. You know, we do live in a networked world where we're all sort of invested in how everything turns out for each other. I mean, even to kind of go the other way in causality, I think the Brexit results over here in the UK kind of informed the election in the United States a little bit later in 2016.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that was a connection that Bannon and Trump tried to emphasize when they brought what was that guy? A horrible individual.
Farage.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. A motherfucker.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we're all sort of deeply invested in how everything turns out in all of our mutual countries.
Yeah, I think actually when that visit happened, there was a photo taken of him and Trump in Trump's Trump Tower suite, you know, with the like golden everything.
Yeah.
And I was just like, you know, this is a vision of hell or something like that. These two right-wing imbeciles in their golden room.
This gaudy, awful fucking room that only they would think would be nice. Like, look at all this gold. It's like, ugh. No, so that kind of, I think it loops around to something we were talking about before we started recording. But when we sort of want to redistribute wealth, right, it's not just about looking at somebody who's got 3 yachts and saying, oh, I want a yacht too. I don't want the fucking yachts. I want the same say in how my society plays out that fucker does. You know?
Yeah, that's right. That's the more important issue.
Money and yachts and golden fucking bar stools are not of any interest to most people.
Yeah, and in fact, in a society of greater equality, you would see a lot less of that because those things exist as markers of class distinction, right? So there's much less need for 4 yachts when you're not competing with the guy next to you who has 5.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It'll be a nice future. I think I'm looking forward to it if we can pull it off.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a very bleak place this year. It's, I mean, this episode will be airing in the following year, so who knows what that will bring. But just looking back over 2017, it is, if you kind of form a list of all the things that happened, it's kind of mind-boggling. But I think there is some value to both sort of assessing the fundamental problems of the system we're living in a kind of abstract way like we've done here, and also trying to think about what some solutions to those problems might look like, even if it seems like we're so mired in the muck of just surviving right now that looking at these kind of things is kind of pie in the sky.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of broadly what this whole show is about, right? That, like, I think we sort of acknowledge that the left is sort of a little bit behind on its own work in kind of really actively looking at the circumstances we're in right now, and how all of our ideas will actually apply to them, and how we can kind of take lessons from history, take some looks at socialist theory, and then apply them to the current context that we're actually in, with an eye towards building an actual future that's worth living in.
Yeah.
So, yeah, hopefully we've succeeded in at least helping along the way.
Yes, I think we've covered quite a few of the little sort of sub areas of this topic, and for those of you who are sort of screaming at the podcast that, you know, alienation is a Hegelian concept and doesn't belong in Marx and all this kind of thing, well, I'm aware of those critiques. Like, I know there was that whole debate.
We don't give a shit.
But it's not really the business of this show to get into the minutia of the sort of history of Marxist debates. It's not really what we're interested in doing here, and there will be a podcast for that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think, like, we're broadly not that interested in sort of rehashing the classic sort of debates that socialists have been prone to. We're generally opposed to kind of left sectarianism. We're kind of much more into like sober assessments of, like, a big tent sort of thing, where we'll have sober assessments of all sorts of different ideas and then try to work out where to go from here, rather than rehashing the kind of arguments of the past. So yeah, don't at us about any of that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I think this has been a pretty fantastic episode. We are on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook at General Intellect Unit. We have a website, generalintellectunit.net, and we're on, I think, pretty much all of the podcasting apps by now. So if you haven't already, subscribe. If there's a facility to do so, leave a rating, a review or something. Or just, you know, pass it along to your friends or anyone you think who might appreciate this this kind of content. I think in 2 weeks we'll be back with, I think we're talking about Red Plenty next. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That is the plan.
It's going to be good. I'm enjoying it so far. It's a remarkably easy read. It's quite a breezy book.
Yeah, an opportunity for people to jump in and give it a shot.
Yeah, you can get ahead of that. Definitely. Do we know what we're doing afterwards?
Well, I think we'll save that.
Yeah,
because it'll be a ways out from the time of our recording, so I'd like to retain some editorial control on that one.
Yeah, what fucking day is it? It's the 10th of December today. Yeah, we're basically taking the rest of December off, but we're going to figure out what to do after Red Plenty. Yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye.